Close your eyes. Imagine the sheer, overwhelming emptiness of the West Mesa. Miles of scrubland outside Albuquerque, baking under a relentless New Mexico sun. The only sound, the wind, a constant, whispering companion, snaking through the sagebrush, lifting dust devils that dance like ghosts before vanishing. It's a landscape that feels ancient, indifferent, a place where things get buried. Now picture this, February 2009, just another day out there in that vast silence. A woman walks her dog along the edge of the mesa. Routine, mundane, until the dog stops, sniffs frantically at something half hidden in the sand. Not a stick, not a rock, a bone, a human femur. Cold reality shatters the desert's quiet illusion. That single bone wasn't just a grim discovery. It was a key, unlocking a horror hidden in plain sight for years. This wasn't some ancient burial ground. This wasn't the aftermath of a long-lost tragedy. This was a secret graveyard, a killing field meticulously concealed beneath the shifting sands. And the victims? Women. 11 women. Their lives extinguished. Their disappearances barely causing a ripple in the wider world before they were simply forgotten, left to the whispers of the wind and the scavengers of the mesa. Think about that for a second. 11 human beings. Why did it take a dog, a walk, and pure chance to uncover them? Why had their vanishing, one by one over years, failed to ignite a massive search, a citywide alarm? The relentless media storm such a nightmare should demand. What does it say about who we see and who we choose not to see? That bone wasn't just evidence. It was an accusation. Buried in the sand of West Mesa lies a forgotten truth, and the desert wind is finally ready to tell it. 11 women. Just let that number sink in. 11 distinct lives, each a universe of hopes, fears, laughter, and pain, extinguished, snatched away. They weren't just victims of a killer. They were victims of something far more insidious long before they vanished. They were stripped of their basic humanity by labels. Labels like high risk, addict, prostitute. Labels society uses like blindfolds. So we don't have to see the person underneath. So we feel justified in looking away. Think about that term, high risk. It sounds clinical, detached, like they were somehow asking for it, like their lives held less value because of the struggles they faced. Addiction, poverty, the desperate choices survival sometimes forces on the margins. Society teaches us to overlook these women, to see them as problems, not people, to dismiss their disappearances as inevitable, even expected, a tragic footnote in a story we've already decided we know the ending to. But they were so much more than the worst moments of their lives. They were daughters. Some were sisters. Some were mothers. They left behind families whose worlds shattered the moment they didn't come home. Families who loved them fiercely, flaws and all. Families who knew the vibrant, complex person behind the label the world slapped on them. Their names deserve to be remembered, spoken aloud, not lost in the chilling anonymity of a statistic. Julie Nieto, Monica Candelaria, Doreen Marquez, Jamie Barella, Veronica Romero, Victoria Chavez, Selenia Edwards, Cinnamon Elks, Evelyn Salazar, Michelle Valdez, Virginia Cloven. 11 names, 11 stolen lives. Each of these women vanished between 2003 and 2005, a dark, concentrated period of terror on the fringes of Albuquerque. Did anyone report them missing? Absolutely. Mothers called, sisters pleaded, friends begged for help. They walked into police stations, clutching photos, their voices thick with fear, clutching onto the fragile hope that someone in authority would listen, would care, would act. And what did they often find? A wall, not always literal, but a wall of indifference, of preconceived notions, of devastating dismissal. Imagine being a mother, frantic because your daughter hasn't been home in days, hasn't called, hasn't shown up for work she desperately needed. Imagine sitting across from a detective, pouring out your terror, only to see their eyes glaze over, to hear the phrase, spoken or heavily implied, "She's an addict. She probably just ran off. She'll turn up when she needs money or a fix." Or the even colder, bureaucratic version, "Adults have the right to disappear." Just another addict walking away. That phrase isn't just careless. It's corrosive. It dehumanizes. It absolves. It tells a grieving family that their loved one's life isn't worth the paperwork, isn't worth the manpower, isn't worth the effort. It reduces a complex human being, with a name and a history and people who love her, to a stereotype, a problem solved by her own supposed instability. How many times was that phrase uttered in those Albuquerque precincts between 2003 and 2005? How many desperate pleas were met with that shrug of institutional neglect? The families weren't naive. Many knew their loved ones struggled. They knew the dangers of the streets. That's why they were scared. That's why they reported them missing immediately. They weren't reporting a rebellious teenager who stormed out after an argument. They were reporting a profound, terrifying break in a pattern, a sudden silence where there should have been noise, however chaotic that noise might sometimes have been. They knew something was terribly wrong, but their screams landed in a void created by bias, by underfunded departments overwhelmed by crime, and by a societal willingness to write off certain lives as disposable. When Monica Candelaria vanished in 2004, her family plastered the city with flyers. They knocked on doors. They searched themselves. Imagine their exhaustion, their growing despair, met not with amplified resources, but with that crushing sense that no one in power truly believed Monica mattered enough to warrant a serious search, that her life, tangled in hardship, was somehow less precious. Jamie Barella, only 15 years old when she disappeared in 2004. 15, a child by any measure. Yet, because she was already caught in a cycle far too big for her, the system failed to see a vulnerable girl. They saw a high-risk youth, a label that seemed to lessen the urgency. Her family's anguish was met with the same chilling inertia. A 15-year-old girl vanishes, and the response is muted? What does that say? Doreen Marquez, Julie Nieto, Veronica Romero. Each disappearance followed a heartbreakingly similar pattern. Frantic family report. Initial perfunctory steps by police. Then the slow fade. The case file moves to the bottom of the pile. The phone calls from family become echoes in an empty room. The hope curdles into a desperate, gnawing dread, because the silence from the authorities speaks volumes. It screams, she wasn't important enough. This wasn't just about finding a killer later. This was about the immediate aftermath of each vanishing. The crucial hours, days, weeks when trails are fresh, when witnesses might remember, when intervention could have potentially saved a life, or at the very least, signaled that someone cared, that these women were valued, that their absence was a crime against the community itself. That void the families screamed into? It wasn't passive. It was actively constructed by indifference. It was a policy of neglect enacted upon the most vulnerable. These 11 women didn't vanish into thin air. They vanished into the gaping chasm of societal neglect. They vanished because the system designed to protect everyone failed them utterly at the most fundamental level. They were reported missing, yes, but were they truly sought? Were their lives treated with the urgency, the gravity, the sheer human concern they deserved? The answer, written in the years of silence and the sand of the West Mesa, is a devastating, undeniable no. They weren't just lost. They were erased. They were discarded, long before their bodies were buried. Their value in the eyes of the system that should have protected them had already been buried. Their disappearances weren't tragedies that slipped through the cracks. They were tragedies pushed through the cracks by a society all too willing to let them fall. To understand how 11 women could vanish, seemingly without a trace, and lie buried for years, you need to understand the place. Ground Zero, Albuquerque's West Mesa. It wasn't just where it happened, it was why it happened. This sprawling expanse on the city's edge wasn't just empty land. It was a stage perfectly set for horror. Picture it, thousands of acres of raw, open desert, flat scrublands stretching towards the horizon, broken only by deep, jagged gashes in the earth, arroyos. These dry riverbeds, carved by rare flash floods, snake through the landscape like scars. They're steep-sided, shadowy, hidden worlds within the emptiness. To developers in the early 2000s, this was potential, cheap land, room to expand, a blank canvas for future neighborhoods. They saw dollar signs on the dusty horizon. But predators see differently. They don't see potential. They see opportunity. They see isolation. They see vast, unpatrolled emptiness where screams wouldn't echo far enough for anyone to hear. They see those deep arroyos, perfect for dragging someone unseen, perfect for digging, perfect for hiding terrible secrets beneath a thin layer of sand and scrub. The West Mesa wasn't just remote. It was conveniently forgettable. A no-man's land on the doorstep of a growing city too busy to look too closely at its fringes. It was a perfect hunting ground because it offered the two things a hunter needs: access to prey and a place to hide the kill. And the prey? They were there. Vulnerable women, struggling, often working the streets not far from this desolate expanse. The very struggles that made them high risk in the eyes of the system, addiction, poverty, instability, also made them tragically accessible targets. They lived and worked in the shadows cast by the city's bright lights, shadows that stretched right out onto the West Mesa. But here's the crushing truth. This wasn't just random evil exploiting random geography. This was systemic. The environment was only half the equation. The other half, the deafening silence from the very people whose job it was to protect them. The police. Remember those families? Screaming into the void? Their pleas weren't just ignored by a distracted city. They were actively dismissed by the institution built to serve them. Reports came in, one by one, over those crucial years, 2003, 2004, 2005, a daughter missing, a sister gone, a mother vanished. And time and again, the response from certain officers wasn't alarm, wasn't urgency, wasn't even basic professional curiosity. It was a cold, crushing logic. She's an addict. She's a prostitute. She probably just ran off. She'll turn up when she's ready. Adults disappear sometimes. That phrase, "she probably ran off," wasn't just a guess. It was a verdict, a convenient label slapped onto a complex, terrifying absence. It was a way to close the file without ever really opening an investigation. It absolved the Department of responsibility. Why dedicate resources? Why knock on doors? Why chase leads for someone they'd already decided wasn't worth the effort? Someone whose life, in their biased eyes, was already defined by chaos and poor choices? It was easier to assume she'd chosen to vanish than to confront the horrifying possibility that someone had made her vanish. So, while families lived in agonizing limbo, while mothers stared at phones that never rang, while sisters walked dangerous streets putting up flyers the rain would wash away, the official machinery barely sputtered. No missing persons bulletins with real urgency. No task forces formed as the disappearances mounted. No connections made between the names Julie, Monica, Doreen, Jamie, Veronica, Victoria, Selenia, Cinnamon, Evelyn, Michelle, Virginia. 11 separate cases, treated as isolated incidents, sad, perhaps, but ultimately inevitable outcomes for those kinds of women. No dots were connected because no one with the power to connect them cared enough to look at the bigger, terrifying picture taking shape right on their doorstep. Think about that. Women vanishing, one after another, from the same general area, often connected to the same high-risk environments. Over a relatively short period, it screams pattern. It screams danger. Yet, no alarm was raised. No warning went out to other vulnerable women. No extra patrols scanned the desolate stretches of the West Mesa at night. The city kept growing, bustling, oblivious. The desert kept its secrets. And the predator, whoever he was, operated with terrifying impunity, shielded not just by the vast emptiness of the land, but by the vast indifference of the system. How does this happen? How does an entire police department, filled with individuals who surely joined to serve and protect, fail so catastrophically? It wasn't just one bad cop. It was a culture, a systemic bias baked into the way they viewed or refused to view certain segments of their own community. When you start categorizing human beings as less than, as disposable, as inherently unstable and therefore not worthy of full protection, you create cracks, and predators thrive in those cracks. The West Mesa wasn't just a geographical blind spot. It became a moral blind spot, enabled by institutional apathy. So, the disappearances continued, unnoticed by the wider public, unconnected by the authorities, unchallenged. The vast, empty landscape did its part, swallowing the women whole. But the true darkness wasn't just out there in the arroyos. It was in the precinct houses, in the filing cabinets where reports gathered dust, in the dismissive shrugs that met desperate tears. The West Mesa provided the stage and the grave. The system provided the silence and the permission, which forces us to ask the most agonizing question of all, one that haunts the families to this day. How many of these 11 women could have been saved if just one officer, looking at one of those early missing persons reports, had truly listened to the raw terror in a mother's voice? If just one detective had felt a flicker of professional curiosity, looked beyond the label of addict or prostitute, and seen a human being in imminent danger? If just one connection had been made between two, or three, Of those vanished faces? Could an alarm have been raised in time? Could patrols have been shifted? Could warnings have been issued? Could a killer have been flushed out before the toll reached 11? We'll never know, because the system didn't listen. It didn't look. It didn't connect. It dismissed. And in that void of official concern, fueled by bias and neglect, the West Mesa transformed from empty desert into a killing field. The graves were dug not just by the killer's hands, but by the collective failure of those sworn to protect the most vulnerable among them. The sand didn't just cover the bodies. It covered the indifference that allowed them to be buried there in the first place. For years, that's how long the secret stayed buried under the sand of the West Mesa. For years since the last woman vanished. For years of silence from the authorities. For years of agonizing uncertainty for the families. Life in Albuquerque moved on. The desert baked under the sun. The wind swept across the scrub, and the city's edges crept a little further out. Then, on a day like any other in February 2009, routine shattered the silence. A woman took her dog for a walk out on the mesa, not deep into the wilderness, just on the fringes, near where new developments were slowly encroaching. A normal walk, until the dog stopped, started digging, not playfully, frantically, urgently, and it pulled something out of the dirt. Not a stick, not a rock, a bone, a human femur. The desert, it seemed, was finally ready to give up one of its secrets. The call went out. Police arrived, expecting what? Probably a lone, tragic discovery. A cold case. Maybe. Someone lost years ago. A hiker. A wanderer. A sad footnote. They cordoned off the area, started a careful search, and then they found another bone. And another. Not scattered randomly. Not ancient. Deliberately placed. Hidden. They weren't just looking at one body. They were standing at the edge of a graveyard. Sound, the wind sound subtly changes, becoming thinner, colder, almost whispering. Shallow graves. That's the horrific term. Not deep pits. Not carefully dug tombs. Holes scraped into the hard earth. Just deep enough to conceal. Covered hastily with sand and brush. And inside them, not one skeleton. Not two. 11. 11 sets of remains. Stacked in that unforgiving ground. A nightmare made real beneath the wide New Mexico sky. This wasn't a single tragedy lost to time. This was a deliberate, sustained horror. A killing field operating right on the city's doorstep for years. Completely unseen. The scene that unfolded was beyond grim. Imagine the shock settling over the officers. The forensic teams arriving. The sheer scale of it. 11 human beings. The initial horror was overwhelming. But then came the small, devastating details that cut even deeper. Some of the women were found still clutching things. Tiny fragments of the lives violently ripped away. A small toy, a cheap trinket, a worn piece of jewelry, personal items, maybe held tight in a final moment of fear, or perhaps dropped by the killer as he buried his victims. These weren't just bones. They were mothers, daughters, sisters. The toy spoke of a child left behind. The trinket hinted at a moment of simple joy, a connection to the world outside the struggle. These objects were silent screams, testaments to the humanity the killer tried to erase and the world had largely ignored. But piecing together the truth from that desolate grave site was a monumental, heartbreaking task. Nature hadn't been kind. Time hadn't stood still. Coyotes, scavengers drawn by the scent, had disturbed some of the graves. They'd dragged bones away, scattering them across the mesa. Wind and rain had eroded the shallow burial sites. The relentless sun had bleached and weathered remains, identifying these women, giving them back their names, their stories, their dignity. It was like trying to solve a shattered, sun-bleached puzzle scattered across miles of harsh desert. Forensic anthropologists became archaeologists of horror. They meticulously mapped the site. They walked grids, eyes scanning the ground for the smallest fragment, a tooth, a finger bone, a piece of clothing caught on a thorn bush. They used screens to sift the sand. Every bone fragment, every shred of evidence, no matter how small, was collected, cataloged, analyzed. DNA testing became crucial. But it was slow, painstaking work, matching degraded samples to family members who had waited years, their hope fading but never extinguished. Dental records, old x-rays, anything that could provide a clue was chased down. It wasn't just science. It was a race against time and decay to restore identity, to answer the desperate questions of families who had lived in limbo for far too long. Months passed as the grim puzzle slowly came together. Bone by bone, match by match. Julie Nieto, Monica Candelaria, Doreen Marquez, Jamie Barella, Veronica Romero, Victoria Chavez, Selenia Edwards, Cinnamon Elks, Evelyn Salazar, Michelle Valdez, Virginia Cloven. One by one, names were returned to the remains. The whispers of the missing became confirmed tragedies. The void the families had screamed into was finally filled with a terrible, concrete truth: they were gone. Murdered, buried like refuse in the sand. And as the identities emerged, a chilling, undeniable pattern solidified, cutting through the forensic complexity. Look at the names. Look at the faces in the photos families provided to the media in a desperate bid for answers years earlier. All young women, all Latina, all poor, all battling the demons of addiction or caught in the desperate cycle of survival. Sex work, the very factors that had made them invisible to the system while they were alive. The killer hadn't chosen randomly. He had preyed specifically on the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, the most easily overlooked women in Albuquerque, the ones society had already pushed to the fringes, the ones the police had largely dismissed when they vanished. Women who slipped through the cracks in life, only to be violently forced through the cracks in the earth. The discovery on the West Mesa wasn't just about finding bodies. It was a brutal, undeniable exposure. It laid bare the horrifying consequence of that systemic neglect, that societal blindness. The desert hadn't just hidden the women. It had hidden the monstrous efficiency with which a predator had exploited the vulnerabilities created by poverty, addiction, and institutional indifference. These 11 women hadn't just been murdered. They had been failed, utterly and completely, long before they were led out to that desolate stretch of land. They were failed by the society that refused to see them as fully human, and by the system that refused to look for them when they disappeared. The sand had covered their bodies, but the discovery ripped the cover off the ugly truth of how they came to be buried there. The nightmare was finally out in the open, exposed by a dog, a bone, and the relentless, revealing light of the desert sun. The discovery on the West Mesa was a bomb blast. 11 bodies. The sheer horror of it finally forced the world to look. Albuquerque reeled. The families, shattered by years of uncertainty, now faced the crushing finality of confirmation. But amidst the grief, a fierce, desperate hope ignited. Now they would find who did this. Now justice would come. The police promised a massive investigation. Resources poured in. At least initially, the spotlight was blinding. Surely, with such a monstrous crime exposed, the killer couldn't hide? Reality, cold and hard, quickly set in. This wasn't the beginning of justice. It was the start of a different kind of nightmare. The investigation into the West Mesa murders didn't just stall. It became a ghost, a phantom effort haunted by missed chances, lost opportunities, and a chilling silence where answers should have been. Suspects? Oh, names surfaced. Rumors flew. One figure loomed large early on, a local construction worker named Lorenzo Montoya. He knew the West Mesa intimately. His job took him out there. He had a violent history, arrests for assault. Crucially, he lived near the area where the women vanished. He even resembled a sketch based on witness accounts of a man seen with one victim. For a moment, it seemed like a break. Police searched his property. They questioned him intensely. Hope flickered, then died. Concrete evidence linking him directly to the murders? It wasn't there. Or it wasn't found. Or it wasn't enough. Montoya was never charged. He died by suicide in 2006, years before the bodies were even found, taking whatever he knew, if anything, to his grave. Another name emerged, Joseph Blee, already serving time for the sexual assault and murder of a teenage girl in Albuquerque, and suspected in others. His timeline overlapped with some of the West Mesa disappearances. Was he capable? Absolutely. But again, the crucial thread connecting him definitively to those 11 graves? It frayed. It broke. It vanished. No charges were ever filed against Blee for the West Mesa killings. He died in prison in 2022. The problem wasn't a lack of names. It was a lack of proof. And the reasons for that lack are where the investigation truly unraveled, revealing failures that felt like cruel echoes of the neglect that allowed the women to vanish in the first place. Think about the crime scene itself. The bodies were buried in shallow graves on open land, exposed to the elements and scavengers for years. Crucial forensic evidence, hair, fibers, DNA under fingernails if there was a struggle. was likely degraded, scattered, or destroyed by time, weather, and animals long before the site was discovered in 2009. The killer had a massive head start, not just in committing the crimes, but in letting the desert erase his traces. But the failures went deeper than nature. They were human. They were institutional. Reports surfaced of botched leads in the initial missing persons investigations years earlier. Tips that weren't followed up thoroughly. Potential witnesses who were never properly interviewed when memories were fresh. Connections between the disappearances that weren't made because the cases weren't prioritized. The foundation for solving these murders wasn't just weak. It was cracked and crumbling before the bodies were even found. And then, the haunting refrain, lost files, vanished paperwork, critical documents related to the original missing persons reports, or early tips in the murder investigation, seemed to slip through the cracks of the very system meant to uphold justice. How do you build a case when pieces of the puzzle are just gone? How do families trust a process that loses the evidence of their loved ones' disappearances? Witnesses died, key people who might have seen something, known something, heard something in those crucial years between 2003 and 2005, passed away before they could be thoroughly questioned, or before their testimony could be secured for a trial that never materialized. Time wasn't just erasing physical evidence, it was erasing people. The families watched this unfold with a rage born of bitter familiarity. They saw the initial flurry of activity, the press conferences, the promises, and then the slow fade. The resources dwindled, the task force scaled back, the leads grew colder, the headlines shrank, their cries for answers, for accountability, met a new, devastating dismissal. There's not enough evidence. It's a complex case. These things take time. To the families, it felt like history repeating. The same indifference, just dressed in different clothes. Their agonizing question cut to the bone. They didn't care when they were alive. Why care now? Why? When the whole world was watching. Could the system still not deliver? The media spotlight, so intense at the moment of discovery, proved just as fickle as the police attention had been years before. The West Mesa murders made for shocking headlines. Gripping, true crime segments for a few weeks, maybe months. But 11 murdered marginalized women? It wasn't a story with easy answers, a charismatic villain, or a satisfying resolution. It was messy. It was ugly. It implicated societal failures no one really wanted to stare at for too long. So, the cameras moved on. The documentaries focused elsewhere. The national attention faded. The story became local news, then barely news at all. The women, once briefly thrust into the spotlight, became footnotes again, this time in the vast, grim library of unsolved American true crime. A macabre curiosity, not a living injustice demanding resolution. And the killer, whoever he was, whatever darkness drove him to prey on 11 vulnerable women and bury them in the desert, he walked free. He may still walk free. That's the chilling reality that hangs over the West Mesa like a permanent shadow. No arrest, no conviction, no named killer held accountable. Just silence, an open wound. But the real failure, the one that runs deeper than any botched lead or lost file, is the failure of value. The investigation became a ghost because the victims, even in death, were still fighting against the perception that their lives didn't matter enough. Not enough to warrant the relentless, expensive, decades-long pursuit that high-profile victims often receive. Not enough to sustain media pressure. Not enough to overcome the institutional inertia and past mistakes that crippled the case from the outset. The ghost investigation haunts Albuquerque, not just because a killer escaped, but because it proved, tragically, that the system's initial assessment of these women's worth, the assessment that led to their disappearances being ignored, was somehow reinforced, not overturned, by their murders. Finding their bodies didn't magically erase the bias that failed them while they lived. It just buried it under a new layer of bureaucratic failure and fading public interest. The justice they deserved remained, like their killer, a phantom seen only in the desperate hopes of their families, never grasped in reality. We stand here, years later, looking back at the horror of the West Mesa, the 11 graves, the failed investigation, the killer walking free. It's easy to feel outrage at the predator, anger at the police failures, sadness for the families. But if we stop there, we miss the hardest truth, the most uncomfortable truth, the one that doesn't just live out there in the desert sand, but lives in here, in the heart of our society, We need to be brutally honest with ourselves. We decide whose lives matter. These 11 women: Julie, Monica, Doreen, Jamie, Veronica, Victoria, Selenia, Cinnamon, Evelyn, Michelle, Virginia, they weren't simply forgotten. That word suggests a passive accident, a slip of the mind. What happened to them was far more active, far more cruel. They were discarded, long before they vanished, long before they were buried in shallow graves. They were stripped of their value in the eyes of the world, labeled, reduced, prostitute, junkie, addict, high risk. These weren't just descriptions of their struggles. They were judgments, sentences. They became shorthand for less than, for disposable. Their worth was measured, coldly, by their vulnerability, by their place on society's margins. We learned to see them not as complex human beings, daughters, sisters, mothers, friends, but as problems, as statistics, as cautionary tales. We learned to look past them, to ignore their presence on the street corners, in the rundown motels, in the shadows where desperation lived. We learned to believe they didn't matter as much. And when you dehumanize people, when you decide some lives are inherently worth less care, less protection, less outrage when they suffer, you create shadows, deep, dark places where predators can operate. You become, unwittingly or not, an accomplice, not to the killing itself, perhaps, but to the conditions that made the killing possible, to the blindness that allowed it to happen again, and again, and again, unseen. Think about it. Why did the police dismiss their disappearances? Why were their families met with shrugs and the poisonous phrase, "She probably ran off"? Because the officers, individuals within a system shaped by our broader society, had already absorbed that message. These women aren't worth the same effort. Their lives, tangled in addiction and poverty and sex work, were already seen as chaotic, unstable, less valuable. Their vanishing fit a narrative society had already written for them, a narrative of inevitable downfall, not of foul play requiring urgent action. The system didn't fail them randomly. It failed them because of who they were perceived to be. The West Mesa killer didn't choose his victims by chance. He chose them precisely because they were vulnerable, precisely because they were marginalized, precisely because they lived and worked in the shadows society had cast over them. He knew they were less likely to be searched for. He knew their disappearances were less likely to trigger alarm bells. He knew the light of concern, of protection, didn't shine brightly where they walked. He hunted where the light didn't reach. Because we, collectively, allowed those shadows to exist. We allowed those women to be pushed into the darkness. So, the question the West Mesa screams isn't just, who did this? That question may never be answered. The deeper, more terrifying question it forces us to confront is, how many other West Mesas are there? How many other hidden burial grounds exist right now? Not just in deserts, but in forgotten corners of our cities, in overlooked rural areas, in the blind spots we deliberately create. How many other vulnerable people, not just women, but anyone society deems lesser? The homeless, the addicted, the undocumented, the mentally ill, the poor trapped in cycles of violence. How many of them are vanishing into those shadows, their cries unheard, their absence unnoticed or dismissed, because we refuse to look, because we refuse to truly see them as fully human, deserving of the same fundamental protection and concern as anyone else? The forgotten truth of the West Mesa isn't buried in the sand. It's buried in our apathy, in our prejudice, in our willingness to categorize people, to label them, to decide some lives are inherently more worthy of safety, of justice, of simple human attention than others. We build the burial grounds with our indifference. We dig the graves with our dismissive labels. We become the darkness that hides the predator. When we hear prostitute, addict, homeless, do we instinctively flinch? Do we subtly withdraw? Do we file them away in our minds as other? As people whose suffering is somehow expected, even deserved? That flinch, that withdrawal, that categorization, that's the fertile ground where predators plant their seeds of violence. That's the permission slip society implicitly signs. The women of the West Mesa were failed long before they met the killer. They were failed every time someone looked at them and saw only a label, not a person. They were failed every time a system designed to protect everyone decided they weren't worth the resources. They were failed every time the rest of us looked away, comfortable in the belief that their struggles were theirs alone. separate from our own safe worlds. Confronting this truth isn't about guilt. It's about responsibility. It's about recognition. It's about dismantling the hierarchy of human value that exists in our hearts and in our institutions. It's about shining a light, relentlessly, into the shadows we've allowed to grow. It's about demanding that every missing person report is treated with urgency, regardless of who is missing. It's about seeing the humanity in everyone, especially those society tells us to overlook. It's about refusing to be accomplices through our silence, our assumptions, or our indifference. The sand of the West Mesa held its secret for years, but the deeper secret, the forgotten truth, was always visible. It was in the way we turned away. The desert didn't just bury 11 women. It held up a mirror, and what it reflected was a society that too often decides some lives are disposable. Until we change that reflection, until we truly believe that every life matters with equal, fierce intensity, the shadows will remain, and the predators will keep hunting in the dark places we create. Time passes, the shock fades, the headlines disappear, the frantic energy of the investigation drains away. What's left at the West Mesa today? What remains of the 11 lives violently ended and buried beneath the sand? Go out there now. Stand on that stretch of scrubland. You won't find a grand memorial, no soaring monument etched with names, no quiet garden for reflection. The scale of the horror isn't matched by the scale of remembrance. Instead, you'll see simple, wind-scarred crosses, rough wood, maybe painted white once, now bleached and weathered by the relentless sun and scouring sand. Some might have faded plastic flowers tied to them, colors dulled by dust and time. They look fragile, temporary, like whispers against the vast, indifferent silence of the mesa, markers placed by families, by advocates, by those who refuse to let the world forget entirely. They stand as quiet, stubborn defiance against erasure. There is no closure here, not for the families. How could there be? They know their daughters, sisters, mothers were murdered. They know their bodies were found, but they don't know who did it. They don't know why. They don't know the final moments, the details that haunt the spaces between sleep and waking. The killer walks free, a shadow without a name. The investigation is cold, buried under layers of failure and time. The promise of justice evaporated like a desert mirage. So, the families wait. They beg. They plead with anyone who might still listen. The police, the media, the public. Give us answers. Find who did this. Give us something, anything, to hold on to. Their screams aren't the raw shrieks of fresh discovery. They are the low, persistent, unanswered cries of years of living with an open wound. A wound inflicted not just by a killer, but by the crushing weight of official silence and societal neglect, both then and now. And while they grieve, while they plead, the world moves on. The city grows. Developers look at that stretch of land on the West Mesa, land forever stained by horror, and they see opportunity, value, potential for condos, for houses, for profit. The whispers are there. It's prime real estate. It's just sitting there. The idea that this ground, this killing field, this mass grave, could be paved over, built upon, turned into someone's backyard or living room. It feels like the ultimate insult, a final erasure, turning sacred ground of unimaginable suffering into just another plot on a developer's map. It screams that the market value of dirt outweighs the human value of the lives buried beneath it, that the victims, even in death, are still obstacles to progress, to profit, to forgetting. But if you stand out there on the mesa, away from the noise of the city, away from the hum of potential construction, and you truly listen, you hear something else. In the silence, beneath the sighing wind, there are echoes, faint, insistent. They aren't ghosts wailing. They are voices carried on the dust. Voices saying, "Remember us. See us. We were here. Fight for the ones like us who are still invisible." These women, Julie, Monica, Doreen, Jamie, Veronica, Victoria, Selenia, Cinnamon, Evelyn, Michelle, Virginia, they were more than victims of a single predator. They were victims of a cascade of failures, failed by a society that labeled them disposable long before they vanished, failed by a police force that dismissed their disappearances with callous indifference, failed by an investigation that crumbled under the weight of its own mistakes and apathy, failed by a media that shone a bright light for a moment, then moved on, failed by a justice system that offered no answers, no accountability. They were people, Complex, flawed, loved, human people, failed by everyone who should have seen their worth, protected their vulnerability, and sought them when they were lost. Their truth, the truth of West Mesa, isn't a cold case file gathering dust in some evidence room. It's not just a sad, unsolved mystery for true crime enthusiasts. It's a burning mirror held up to us all. It forces us to look at the reflection we so often try to avoid. It reflects our collective willingness to turn away from the suffering of the marginalized. It shows us the hierarchy of human value we unconsciously accept, whose pain matters, whose disappearance sparks alarm, whose lives are deemed worthy of relentless pursuit. It exposes the cracks in our systems, cracks wide enough for predators to walk through and for vulnerable people to fall into. It reveals the uncomfortable reality that neglect isn't passive. It's a choice with devastating consequences. It shows us how easily outrage fades, how quickly attention shifts, leaving the hardest truths buried under the sand of our own convenience. The wind-scarred crosses are more than markers. They are questions, demands. Did you learn? Are you looking now? Are you fighting for the invisible ones today? The unanswered screams of. The families aren't just cries for their own lost loved ones. They are a siren call for every vulnerable person still living in the shadows. A demand that we dismantle the biases that make them targets. A demand that we hold institutions accountable for protecting everyone, not just the privileged. A demand that we refuse to let land developers pave over sacred ground of suffering. The legacy of West Mesa isn't found in solved cases or captured killers. It's found in the dust that still carries their names. It's found in the fading flowers placed by hands that refuse to forget. It's found in the persistent, unanswered screams that echo across the mesa and into the conscience of a city, a society that allowed this to happen. It's found in the burning reflection of our own failures staring back at us. Will we look away again? Or will we finally see what the mirror shows? Will we let the screams fade into the wind? Or will we amplify them? Will the crosses stand as lonely sentinels in a desert of forgetting? Or will they become the foundation stones for real change? The desert holds the bones. The families hold the grief. But we hold the responsibility to ensure their truth doesn't get buried a second time. The mirror is held up. What do you see? Listen to that silence. It's the sound of the desert holding its breath, holding its secrets for now, because the West Mesa teaches us one brutal, undeniable truth. The desert doesn't keep secrets forever. Time is relentless. Wind scours, rain carves, erosion exposes what was hidden. Someday, maybe years from now, maybe decades, the shifting sands will reveal more. Another bone fragment, a button, a shred of cloth the killer missed. The desert will confess. It has no loyalty to monsters. It gives up its dead, piece by stubborn piece, to the unforgiving light. But here's the hard reality. Waiting for the desert to do our work for us? That isn't justice. It's cowardice. It's passive. It's hoping the landscape will absolve us of our responsibility to act now, to fight now, to remember now. Real change, the kind that prevents another West Mesa, that tears down the shadows where predators hunt the vulnerable, doesn't emerge from dusty graves or patient geology. It starts with us. It ignites the moment we refuse to look away. It starts when we demand it, when we stop accepting the shrugs, the lost files, the cold cases, when we hold institutions accountable for protecting everyone. Not just the convenient, the privileged, the easy to see, when we demand that every missing person, regardless of their story, their struggle, their label, is sought with the same fierce urgency. It starts when we see the unseen, when we consciously rip off the blindfold of prejudice, when we look at the woman on the corner, the man sleeping rough, the addict fighting their demons, and we see a person first, a human being deserving of dignity, safety, and the full weight of our concern if they vanish. When we challenge the labels society slaps on them, prostitute, junkie, homeless, and recognize them for what they are, dehumanizing excuses to ignore suffering. It starts when we scream their names until the world can't look away. Not just once, but relentlessly. Julie Nieto, Monica Candelaria, Doreen Marquez, Jamie Barella, Veronica Romero, Victoria Chavez, Selenia Edwards, Cinnamon Elks, Evelyn Salazar, Michelle Valdez, Virginia Cloven. 11 names, 11 lives stolen. Scream them, remember them, force their stories into the light. Let them be a battering ram against apathy. Let their absence be a constant, deafening alarm that cannot be silenced. The ultimate truth of West Mesa isn't buried out there in the sand. Dig all you want. The desert will only give you bones. The real truth is buried in here. Inside us. Inside our society. In the dark corners of our collective conscience where we allow indifference to fester. Where we tolerate the hierarchy of human value. Where we sometimes choose convenient blindness over uncomfortable sight. It's buried in our refusal to forget. Forget the women. Forget the failures. Forget the uncomfortable mirror they hold up to our world. Forget that predators still hunt where we allow the light to fail. This refusal, this active, stubborn, furious remembering, is the only soil where real justice and true prevention can ever grow. So don't wait for the wind to whisper the killer's name. Don't wait for the sand to surrender the final clue. The desert will speak in its own time. Our time to speak is now. Our time to see is now. Our time to scream is now. The truth isn't just out there on the mesa. It lives in here, in our refusal to let the silence win. Remember them. Fight for them. Fight for the unseen. The desert remembers. Make sure we do too.